the conventional in the conventional, story of the Buddha 101, like you hear, he went out and he saw, there's suffering and so on, and he finally figures out that, nothing lasts forever. People die. If you're too attached to these things, that will lead to trouble. You have to accept the impermanence of things. So that's a common rendering of the story. And there's truth to that, of course. There's nothing, right. No pleasure is going to last forever, and yet we do kind of delude ourselves into anticipating pleasures as if they were going to last longer than they are. So there is that, but I assume that the meditative apprehension of impermanence, there's also a more fine-grained apprehension of impermanence than those kinds of things, right?
Right. So if you go a bit solipsistic with it, or you just go empiricist about it. So like an empiricist really who would take, I'm talking like British empiricism, like Hume or whatever. If you take empiricism to its extreme, right, which means the only things that exist in my universe at this time are the actual sensate qualities that are arising. That's sort of the frame in which vipassana and the concept of impermanence makes the most sense. And so, and is the most useful. I don't want to debate questions of grander philosophy, but in terms of practice, if you're actually trying to change your brain in some of these specific ways that the brain can be changed, that's a great frame when doing vipassana, if that makes sense. So,
and by the way, David Hume, in his introspections, came to some conclusions. He's a British empiricist that were very Buddhist. We won't get off on that.
Yes, I totally agree.
Right.
Yeah. But that grounding in the immediacy of just what's going on is a core vipassana point. And if you notice, if you just ignore, sort of more abstract questions of object permanence and all that, as a kid would learn, and stick with empirical permanence, anybody sitting on a cushion will notice that there's like all this stuff coming in really fast, and it's like, that's how it's gone, and there's pain, and there's like this, and the mind moves, and it shifts. It's like, what's weird is that in the face of what's so obviously an initial chaotic experience for most people sitting down on a cushion, that they would somehow reject the concept of impermanence when it's what most people are then overwhelmed by. Do you see what I mean? It's just, weirdly enough, it's a question of taking that even farther until you're so overwhelmed that the identity process becomes short-circuited because it can no longer possibly maintain that in the face of the sensate clarity about the straightforward and obvious fact of impermanence, right? So essentially nobody sits down on the cushion and has a perfectly static experience.
Right.
Right? So, and particularly no beginners sit on the cushion and have a particularly static experience. They have a chaotic experience. That chaos is the point. That, weirdly enough, is what you're looking for. And then you get into this weird thing where people get this paradigmatic or practical conflict between they think they're supposed to make the breath this stable thing, or they think they're supposed to make the mind totally silent, or they think they're trying to stabilize attention, when from a Vipassana point of view, you're trying to do the exact reverse. You're trying to destabilize the experience of everything, or you might say recognize the intrinsically unstable experience of everything, sort of a better way to put that.
Okay. So it's probably clear to people how reconciling yourself to the impermanence of like pleasures and people whom you love, kind of making a peace with that, given that the people are going to die and the pleasures are going to fade, it's probably evident how that could be kind of a therapeutic thing to do. But I gather there's for you more value than that. I mean, in other words, it might not be so obvious to them. Well, what good is it to do to really, really notice how ephemeral thoughts are? I mean, well, we did talk about one sense of that, but I mean,
and it leads to stages of awakening, which are highly recommended for not necessarily always totally obvious reasons, but let's just say highly recommended. And so even if you don't think that impermanence is so great, as a practical point, if you notice it again and again and again, it can do very, very good things to your brain, assuming you do okay through some of the more difficult stages as your identity construct gets torn down. So
it can do good things to your brain in what sense? Just to notice this kind of internal impermanence does what kind of good? Okay,
so going back to sort of more beginnerish relative things, well, actually, they actually extrapolate well down the path as well. If you're really good at noticing thoughts arising and vanishing very, very rapidly with all their little core syllabalistic components, meaning like you notice that a thought of like hi, I'm Daniel is made up of actually all these little, hi, I am Daniel. Like it's got all these little blips to it and nuances and wiggles or whatever it is.
It's granular.
So it's very granular, and each of those are sort of oscillating back and forth with the intentions to create those, the recognition of whether or not they came out created properly.
Okay, but let me just quickly ask you. I mean,
hold on.
What is it that's granular? It's one thing to say that the vocal expression of a thought is granular if you see it closely enough, but
the intentions to think that are equally as granular. So both digital and analog granular. So meaning there's lots of little intentions to think every little part of every little word that you say.
The energy that gives rise to the thought.
The intention. So there's a mental thing. I'm going to say something, and then you say it. And then there's also, as you say it, there are all the little mental impressions of the sounds and the physical sensations of the mouth, oscillating back and forth to say, am I saying this properly? What did I just say? Did the word come out of my mouth properly? And it's also simultaneously setting up to say the next parts and pondering where the whole thing is going. So there's a lot of processing going on, but that's all processing that you can actually see at a sensate level if you get good at this.
And
again, with a better microscope, a better or macroscope, depending on how you're going with your attention, you can start to notice all those little proto-intentions that lead to thought, like I'm going to think a thought, or I'm going to, so you actually have an intention to think a thought, and then you think a thought.
Well, I think most people
to say something, and then you say it, and you also, there's this mental thing if you're monitoring the process and planning where it's going, and all of those things are oscillating back and forth very rapidly in experience, and you can actually learn to notice all of those very clearly as individual components of both the physical experience of talking, for example, and of thinking about what you're going to say and all that stuff.
Of course, the first thing is to notice, before you break the intention down into its granules, is to notice that there's an intention to begin with, which I don't think I would have, which people would not normally do. That itself is a meditative attainment, right?
That is. That's cause and effect. So when we get from the first attainment of, thoughts are thoughts, that's called mind and body. When you actually see thoughts, they break off and see, those are thoughts. The next stage of practice is cause and effect, where you start to notice, I intend to think, and then a thought arises. I hear a sensation. I hear a sound, and then I make a mental impression of that sound that I can remember. Or I see an image, and then I remember something about that image. Or I decide to, sniffle, and then I sniffle. And then I noticed I was sniffling, and I made a mental impression of that, and then I thought about the mental impression of the sniffle or whatever. Okay. And so you can start to notice that there's this amazing richness to our experience that we actually are using all the time to do practical stuff, but we're only a little bit aware of it. There's not a high degree of awareness of it, and bringing up the awareness of that actually shows you a ton of stuff about your mind, your brain, your sense of identity, who you are, but it also provides great insight into the granular transience of those things. So when suddenly all those things that seem like this huge deal are instead this very fine-grained, ephemeral, sort of rich, intricate, scintillating, fascinating thing, that really is a very different experience from, I'm like suffering.
Yeah.